coronavirus crisis. The Centers for Disease Control has issued new guidelines regarding COVID isolation protocols. Holy Innocents. Learn more about today's feast day honoring babies killed by King Herod. Faith and politics. How a lawmaker from Montana uses his Catholic faith on Capitol Hill. And the Bible in a year. We hear from a Catholic priest whose podcast is downloaded nearly 500,000 times each day. On EWTN News Nightly for Tuesday, December 28th, 2021. Thank you so much for being with us tonight on the Feast of the Holy Innocents. I'm Owen Jensen in for Tracy Sable. The Biden administration admits it cut recommended isolation and quarantine times in half to make sure businesses have enough workers to stay open. That means many people can return to work 5 days after testing positive for COVID instead of the previous 10 days.
If you are asymptomatic and you are infected, we want to get people back to the jobs, particularly those with essential jobs, to keep our society running smoothly.
The revised guidance comes after research shows coronavirus is most likely to spread in the 2 days before and 3 days after symptoms develop. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention says the shortened isolation time applies to people without symptoms. If you still have a fever, stay home. The CDC also changed quarantine times for people exposed to COVID-19, making it more stringent for people who are fully vaccinated or not vaccinated, and easier for people who get booster shots. India is blocking St. Mother Teresa's Missionaries of Charity from receiving foreign funds. The Catholic charity shelters poor people. It's not clear why the government there is taking the action, but some Hindu groups accuse churches of forced Christian conversions. In some parts of India, Christians have come under attack. The Biden administration has said it would reopen the US Consulate in Jerusalem, but it has yet to do so. For years, it served as a de facto embassy to the Palestinians. Israel rejects the plan to reopen it. A brief history here. President Donald Trump shut down the consulate and moved the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem back in 2018. The move infuriated the Palestinians. Israel views Jerusalem as its eternal, undivided capital. The Palestinians seek the eastern part of the city as capital of their hoped-for state. And joining me now to discuss is Rabbi Yaakov Menken, Managing Director for the Coalition for Jewish Values. Rabbi Menken, welcome back. In a recent editorial authored by you, you wrote, quote, "It would be a significant setback for indigenous rights and civil liberties if the United States were to create a Palestinian consulate in Jerusalem." Please explain.
Thank you so much for having me back. And really, it's pretty straightforward. One of the things I do in that piece is walk through the history, not just Jewish history, but Christian history. They recently found another synagogue built in the town of Migdal, which was built slightly before the lifetime of, at least as far as the archaeologists can determine, Mary Magdalene. The only people who called that area Palestine were the European colonialists, the Greeks and the Romans, who came to dominate somebody else's Holy Land. And that is why to now recognize Palestine and to recognize that the marauders who invaded from elsewhere have equal rights to the indigenous in the Holy Land would actually be a step backwards.
You also wrote in the editorial, if President Biden does reopen the consulate, it would essentially contradict the fact that he calls himself a devout Catholic. How so?
You know, I'm actually going to point out that that was something put in by an editor because I said, I'm a rabbi. I can't really tell Catholics what Catholicism is. With that said, I suspect that most of your viewers would agree with what I said, which is that, you know, when you look at Catholic history, Christian history, the Bible of the Christian world, not just Mary Magdalene, but the fact that Jesus came from a town called Bethlehem, which means in Hebrew, house of bread. And he moved, he was actually from a place called Nazareth, which means shoot. And he moved to Jerusalem, Ir Shalom, the city of peace. All of these things speak to the Jewish history of that location, and that is why it is so critical to the Christian narrative.
Now, Palestinians will argue opening a consulate, reopening I should say, would demonstrate U.S. support for Palestinians and help bolster their aim for an independent state with East Jerusalem as its capital. Your reaction to that?
Well, I think that that's exactly the problem. The seat of the government of the Palestinian Authority is Ramallah. If one needs a consulate, that's where it belongs. East Jerusalem is just a name that the Jordanians stuck on that place. To believe that East Jerusalem is distinct from West Jerusalem, it means to claim that the Western Wall and the old city of Jerusalem and David's city and David's citadel are all occupied territory when Israel allows Jews to live there. Remember that under Jordanian rule, the rights of other religious minorities was not respected, and in fact, every Jew in East Jerusalem was ethnically cleansed out, and that's how it became an Arab city. It's simply not fair to not allow the indigenous to return.
So ultimately, why do you think the Biden administration is either hesitating or delaying this?
I think that they're hesitating because they recognize that the Israelis simply have said no, because the Israelis all understand this to be true, that the quote-unquote Palestinians, Arabs, have no legitimate claim to say that, in fact, Jerusalem should be theirs or divided equally. It simply doesn't make sense. It'll require that religious liberties be tossed aside, and all the freedoms that Israel has brought to that region would be withdrawn from East Jerusalem the same way that, sadly, they've been withdrawn from Bethlehem and Ramallah, which is, by the way, why Christians are moving out.
Rabbi Menken, we're going to leave it right there, and thank you so much for your time today. Great to see you.
Thank you for having me.
Coming up, the church remembers King Herod's massacre of the Holy Innocents. And part one of our interview with a Catholic priest whose podcast is one of the most popular in the world. Today is the Feast of the Holy Innocents. This is an episode recounted in the Gospel according to Matthew in which King Herod of Judea ordered a massacre of children under age 2 in order to try and kill baby Jesus. One Catholic historian says, quote, "The act of cruelty perfectly corresponds with Herod's paranoid and merciless character." Joining us now from Poland is Father Dominik Jurczak, professor of theology at the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas, known as the Angelicum. Father Jurczak, thank you very much for joining us. Can you tell us more about the Feast of the Holy Innocents? When did it become a feast day? And what do we know about the children who were killed?
Of course, this feast is very particular because we are celebrating the feast during the octave of Christmas. And the octave of Christmas is a particular 8 days once the church is celebrating the martyrs. So what we are celebrating today, it is the martyrs, innocent martyrs, who gave their life for Jesus Christ. And that's the sense of that feast. So the innocents, they were killed by Herod, and in indirect way, they gave the testimony for Jesus Christ. Herod was obsessed with the power. And here is the message of this feast today. We don't want to be obsessed with the power, but we would like to subject to Jesus Christ, to his power, to his divine power. That's the main idea of this feast.
Now, many church leaders have drawn a comparison between the Holy Innocents and babies who are killed in abortion. Please tell us more about that.
Well, for the church, especially during this octave of the Christmas, what is absolutely necessary is to understand the idea. For the Christians, the crucial point is the birthday, but birthday not to burn to this world, but to burn to the eternity. So for the church, it is absolutely incredible and is absolutely important to be born to the eternal life. That's why life is in the center of this feast. Life, as life of Jesus Christ, is also essential to understand what's the idea of Christmas. And the Christmas begins once we are for life also in this world, in this reality where we live in our countries, in our communities.
Now, switching gears slightly here, you are a Dominican. Can you tell us why 2021 was so important for you and how it relates to your founder, St. Dominik?
2021 was important. It is important once we are celebrating 800 years from the birthday for the heaven, as I said before, of our founder, St. Dominik. So we are celebrating in our communities, and we are celebrating trying to renew our charism, trying to renew our call to share the gospel all over the world. That's why it was crucial. It is crucial also through this Christmas, through this very particular moment in our church, in our communities, in our priories all over the world.
Well, that is very interesting. Merry Christmas to you, and thanks for joining us. Father Dominik Jurczak, Professor of Theology at the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas.
Thanks a lot, and blessed Christmas to all of you.
In the Bible in a Year podcast, Father Mike Schmitz takes listeners through the entire Bible in 365 days. He also offers reflections, prayers, and insights. The podcast has proven to be a hit with 170 million downloads. Recently, our own Tracy Sable spoke with Father Schmitz for a two-part interview. In part one, he tells us what prompted him to begin the project.
And joining me now is Father Mike Schmitz, host of the Bible in a Year podcast. Father, great to see you. So talk to us more about your podcast and what inspired you.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's great to see you too. And yeah, it's been a gift this last year. I think what inspired the whole thing, how it started was a number of things. You know, in 2020, there was this pandemic, and I found myself. So I often take in information audibly, right? So I'll read as much as I can, but I just find that I listen to podcasts, I listen to YouTube videos, listen to talks, and I try to be really exclusive and really picky about, like, I want to listen to wise voices, like things that are really going to help me build me up. But even when I was doing that, one of the things I found is I found myself being constantly distracted. Like I kept looking for the next voice and the next piece of wisdom and the next kind of insight into what's going on in our culture, what's going on in the church. And I found myself being distracted. And then I also, in the midst of kind of some chaos in our world, I found myself being distressed. And those are the two kind of key words that kind of started a lot for me. I was distracted and distressed. And then I was also at the same time reading the book of Judges in the Old Testament. And as I was praying through that book, and I read it before, obviously, and prayed through it before, but it just struck me as here is the people of Israel, here's God's chosen people, and they're going through this cycle of unfaithfulness, and God raises up a judge, and they have some direction, they have some way to go, move forward, and they get back on their feet and then fall again. And just that cycle that would happen, a chapter would be an entire generation. And you think, oh my gosh, one of the key lines in the book of Judges is, at that time, there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And just the chaos that was surrounding normal people who were chosen by God, who had to live in that world of distraction and distress. And I thought, you know what? I think we need the Bible. I think what I need to hear the Bible. And since as I said, I like to take in my information through my ears, I thought, you know what would be a good idea? A good idea would be to have a podcast where we just read the Bible every day for a whole year and get through the entire thing and have this, not just the wisdom of the world, but the wisdom of the word that could just really reshape our lens and really reframe the way we're looking at the chaos and looking at the crises in our culture.
Yeah, and it really has resonated with people, especially with everything that we're going through right now. Can you talk a little bit more about how this podcast and stories from the Bible can really give people hope, again, especially as we're going through this really tough time?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Because I think that, so there's this book that came out of University of Mary in Bismarck, North Dakota, and it is called Moving from Christendom to an Apostolic Age of Mission. And so in the past, up till recently, I think Christians and Catholics specifically would have a biblical worldview. That when we looked at the world, we would actually be looking at it through the lens that's been shaped by these stories, or even the story that God has revealed over the course of 73 books in the Old and New Testaments. And one of the things we've lost, this book points it out, and I can see this in the people I talk with. I see this even in myself. It's, we have so many, as I said, voices that are just constantly in competition to shape our worldview, to shape how we see people, the way we see God, the way we see ourselves, the way we see the point of life, that we need to rediscover and reclaim a biblical worldview. And so I think that's the main goal of this podcast. And one of the things you find when you read the Bible is even those people who were led by the Lord, those who are called and chosen by the Lord, none of them lived in lives of certainty. None of them lived lives of safety. None of them lived lives of security, but every one of them lived. I mean, even think about, here we have this season leading up to Christmas where you have Mary, and we have been reading recently in the daily mass readings, the angel Gabriel visits Mary. And how does that story go down? Well, it goes down where Gabriel says, here's God's plan. Mary asks her clarifying question, how can this happen since I have no relations with the man? Gabriel clarifies the answer, and she says, behold, I'm the handmaid of the Lord. Be it done unto me according to your word. And then the very next line is, then the angel departed from her. And so she has no idea. All she knows is, okay, God's called you to be the mother of his son. She says yes, and then he leaves. And talk about a place of uncertainty, a lack of security, lack of I do have no idea what's going to happen next. And that's the story. That's where you and I get to live every single day. Sometimes we can, I don't know, maybe not all of us, but many of us think that in order to live joyful lives, in order to live lives that are absolutely full, we have to know what's coming next. And we don't. One of the things that going through the Bible like this reminds us of is we're always going to be uncertain. We're always going to be in a place of lack of safety and lack of security. But God's always going to be with us in that uncertainty and in that insecurity.
All right, now later in the newscast, Father Schmitz tells us what project he'll work on once the Bible in a Year podcast is done later this week. Up next, we continue our conversation with Father Mike Schmitz about his podcast, The Bible in a Year. The Bible in a Year podcast. It is one of the most popular podcasts in the entire world. We recently spoke with the host, Father Mike Schmitz. In part one, he told us why he started the podcast. Now in part two, he tells our Trace the Table what he hopes the faithful will gain from the project and what he is planning to do next.
Obviously, again, as I mentioned before, this is really resonating with folks out there. I mean, you get nearly 500,000 downloads per day. That's absolutely incredible and really shows the impact that you're having in people's lives. Are you at all surprised, at the popularity of your podcast? And also, what about the feedback from listeners?
Yeah, I guess when I wrote to Ascension and said, hey, I have this idea, what do you guys think? And they said, great, let's create a plan. And so we built it around the Great Adventure Bible timeline that Jeff Cavins had come up with. I thought, I hope people listen. I did not realize that it would do as well as it's been. And then when it got to number one, maybe the first couple of weeks of 2021, I thought, yeah, when we hit January, it's going to be no longer anywhere near the top. And I think it stayed in the 20s for almost the entire year, give or take, somewhere in there. And I just think that's such a testimony to people's faithfulness and their hunger. And I think, one of the things, well, three things that I think made this podcast more successful is a lot of people have a hunger for the Bible. I think a lot of people are drawn to what is that message that the Lord wants to speak to me, but it's difficult and they get lost. And so I think the three gifts of this particular podcast is we have three things. One is it's easy. You just press play. Like every morning it shows up, you press play and listen. As you're brushing your teeth, as you're driving to work, as you're, your prayer time, whatever it is, just press play. Super simple. The second thing is there's a map, and the map is, again, Jeff's Great Adventure Bible timeline. And so we're going to follow the narrative story and you're not going to get lost. But because third, there's a guide. And I think that having some commentary at the end of every day, just trying to say, okay, here's the context that of what we just heard. And here's how maybe we can try to understand this. I think those three things, you just press play, you have a map and you have a guide. I think that was a really good mixture of ingredients to help people who really desired to hear God's word to be able to actually follow through all 365 days.
Yeah, and you can do it at any time and kind of at your leisure in the morning, afternoon, maybe at bedtime. So that's what really makes it so great. What's next for you, Father? And what's next? Another podcast, possibly?
Well, possibly. I have a day job. Day job is I'm a priest of the Diocese of Duluth, Minnesota, and I work on a college campus right across the street from me here. And so I'm a chaplain there, and I'm director of youth ministry for our diocese. And so that stuff has been consistent, and it's been a great grace to be able to share this with our students. But we're looking at the idea. When I first pitched the idea to Ascension, I said, "How about a combo?" Bible and catechism in a year. And I'm really glad we did do it at the same time, because that would have been a whole other can of worms. But we're looking at possibly, as we move forward in 2023, to have a catechism in a year. And now, one of the reasons why we're taking some time to get the catechism all set up is because we want people, and not everyone's on whatever day today is. And sometimes people are on different paces when it comes to the Bible in 365 days. And so not everyone will finish on December 31st. And so we wanted to give people a time to be able to finish the Bible podcast before they had this other thing, on their shoulders. And so we're going to start it in 2023, God willing, if we get all the T's crossed and I's dotted, so we can actually have the catechism, which would be great. But that's what we're working on now.
And finally tonight, in our Faith and Politics series, correspondent Eric Rosales introduces us to a lawmaker from Montana who has leaned on his Catholic faith in good times and in bad.
Montana Congressman Matt Rosendale is the state's lone representative for over 1 million people. So with each vote, he says he gathers the information from his constituents, analyzes it, and then votes on it and sticks with that vote. He says he relies on his Catholic faith for guidance and the Lord for strength.
Not only did I have the discipline of the Catholic Church, but I also had the discipline of the United States Marine Corps to help me along the path. But we always practiced our faith together as a family, and I really do believe that that is a major part of why my faith is so strong.
Raised in a Catholic family, his father, a U.S. Marine, instilled discipline in him and his 5 siblings. Growing up, the family ran a newspaper business, which struggled at times. A difficult time in his life when he was a teenager. He lost his 17-year-old sister to brain cancer.
So I saw some very difficult times that challenged my family and saw them rely on their faith to get them through that.
Congressman Rosendale says he had to rely on his faith once again when he lost his older brother to cancer. He says if you strongly believe in Jesus' suffering, death, resurrection, and ascension into heaven, then you get through those challenging times.
This is part of a plan. I may not know what the plan is today, but I have learned to accept the outcome of that and just try to open my heart to where my next role is as part of that plan.
A faithful servant mindset is something he and his wife instilled in their 3 sons.
What I am most proud of is that each of them still practices their faith consistently, regularly, and that is critically important. I tell them when things really go bad, that college education isn't what's going to bail you out, help you through it. What's going to help you is your faith.
When it's all said and done and he stands before the Lord, Congressman Rosendale tells me, jokingly, that he hopes that the Lord has somewhere in the corner for him, or he'd even take a broom closet. At the Capitol, Eric Rosales, EWTN News Nightly.
Eric, thank you for that, and we thank you for watching tonight. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Owen Jensen. Good night, and God bless.